This is Dylan Moore with iRead TV coming to you today. It is Monday, March 28th, 2022, and today I have State Senator Keith Wagoner from the Washington State 39th Legislative District here with me in studio today. Senator Wagoner is running for a very hot seat in Washington State this election cycle, which is the Secretary of State position. This position, if you were unaware, if you're listening to this, has been held by a rather controversial figure for, a decade now. And she has just left to join the Team Biden administration for some federal election integrity, something or other. But the important point being is the seat is now up for grabs with no incumbent. And I wanted to get Senator Wagoner in here to talk about why he thinks he's the right man for the job. So, Senator Wagoner, thanks for coming in and giving us your time.
Well, it's a pleasure, Dylan. I'm going to enjoy this. I know it.
Awesome. Awesome. So the first thing I got to ask is, so your state senator, Republican side, I didn't mention that. We are talking about the Republican ticket here, is the Republicans seem to like what you're doing in the state Senate. What motivated you to say, okay, I'm going after that Secretary of State position?
Right. Well, I do think the Republicans like what I'm doing in the state Senate. You know, I've moved up rather quickly in my career there. I'm the minority whip. I sit on the Ways and Means Committee. I sit on Law and Justice. I'm the ranking member on the Behavioral Health Subcommittee. So I've done really well in the Senate. But what motivated me to put my name in the hat for this particular race was the fact that Governor Inslee threw away a chance to really show his bipartisanship, which I know, but one can always hope. He had a chance to put qualified Republicans in a seat that the voters have put a Republican in for 56 straight years. So what that tells me is the voters, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, desire balance and accountability in that spot. Mm-hmm. They have desired it for 5.5 decades, and that he should have appointed a good Republican. There were plenty of them out there, but he chose not to do that. And I believe the voters ought to have what they want. They've wanted a Republican. They've wanted the balance and accountability that a Republican brings to that office for 50 years, and nobody was going for it. And I thought, oh my gosh, we cannot let an Inslee appointee walk away with this office. I'm going to do something about it. So, hence my candidacy.
So, and of course, the Inslee appointee, Steve Hobbs, was he Senate or House? I can't remember.
Senator Hobbs was in the Senate.
Okay. So, there was a Democratic senator who was appointed for this position for, a year now, because we're having the special election to replace him. Or not replace him, but to have an actual election to fill the seat. So, what do you see as the most important functions of the Secretary of State, and how do you feel that your skill set is addressing what those functions need?
Right. Well, I know everybody is tied in knots about election and voting.
We're going to be talking about that, yes.
And we will definitely, and that really is a key function of the Secretary of State, to certify elections and to manage elections according to the law. But it's a much bigger office than that. The Secretary of State's office has about 300 people that are managed by the Secretary of State, and that ranges across a wide area of services from the incorporation of our for-profit organizations, our nonprofit organizations. The Secretary of State is in charge of the state archives and the state library. And one of the functions I think is really important is they represent the state in cultural and economic interests with foreign countries and other states. Mm-hmm. And it's really a leadership position. I hear people say, well, we've had auditors before. It's kind of an anomaly that we had 2 auditors fill that position in a row, and it's not common across the United States. What the Secretary of State's job is really a leadership position, and that's where I excel. I went to a leadership school, United States Naval Academy. I served in the military as a naval officer in leadership roles. I was a helicopter pilot for 23 years. I flew missions across the world. And I have a master's degree in leadership from the University of San Diego. not to mention the fact that I was a city councilman, mayor of the city of Cedar Woolley, and now 5 sessions under my belt in the Senate. So essentially, my entire adult life has been public service in a leadership role, and I think that's really what's key to the Secretary of State's office, and that's going to roll over into how we handle our elections too.
Mm-hmm. What is the most important thing on your agenda if you're to win the election as Secretary of State?
The most important thing, the thing I want to do most for the people of Washington, is bring confidence back to our election system. We have a confidence vacuum right now. And whether you think the entire election was stolen, which I think is a little bit of a far reach, or whether you think it was the fairest, freest election ever, which I think is a bit of a far reach, the Secretary of State needs to answer questions on both ends of that spectrum and do it in a respectful manner. I think you may have seen the governor's bill that he sponsored that was going to make it illegal to, quote, spread misinformation or tell lies about elections.
Nothing but good stuff coming from that guy, by the way.
Oh, yeah. A huge First Amendment infringement. But that's how his folks want to handle elections. If you don't agree with them, they want to shut you up.
In jail, yeah.
I do not like that approach. I think if you have a problem with confidence in the elections, you do better. And that's what I want to do. I want to do better. And I think the 3 most important things to doing better are making sure every legitimate vote gets counted. Mm-hmm. Nobody can disagree with that.
Well, let me flip that around on you. What about the illegitimate votes?
Well, that's next, because I had said 3 things.
Yep.
So number 2 is, if votes are suspicious, when we hear these stories about, a box showed up with 500 votes, oops, and they just dump it. Just dump it into a pile. Well, all the suspicious votes, and they could be legitimate, they could be.
You don't know, yeah.
We need to sequester those, count them separately, do a little investigation and find out the why of that. And if they're good, they're good. And if they're not, they fall into the 3rd category, which is fraudulent votes. And fraudulent votes are not made up. They're documented in our government, and they're not documented particularly well. But those fraudulent votes need to be run to ground, and we need to find out why they're showing up in our ballot boxes, and we need to find out who's putting them there. So those are the 3 things. Count the good votes, look carefully at the suspicious votes, and the fraudulent votes we need to investigate and find out what's going on.
I'm going to have some more specific questions on different aspects of the election system.
Certainly.
In Washington State. But before that, I wanted to ask you, both under the person who just resigned and at least he's running for it, but at the moment he's kind of the temporary replacement, Steve Hobbs. What do you see as the most frustrating thing coming out of the Secretary of State's office?
Okay, so I'm going to call him Secretary Hobbs because he's been appointed by the governor. Even though I don't like it, that is a fact. And I know Steve Hobbs well. He has been a colleague in the Senate, and we've worked well together. I don't think Steve is a bad person. However, he literally owes his job to the governor. I mean, you just can't get away from that. Mm-hmm. And when you're an executive standalone office that has to exercise independent authority over something as important as an election, you can't be owing people things. So that's one problem I have. The other problem I have is that immediately after being appointed to that position, he started speaking the governor's talking points about misinformation.
Oh, God.
And I don't know if you know this, but there's been millions of dollars allocated to the Secretary of State's office through the governor's request as a budget item to, quote, educate voters. Well, one person's education is another person's re-education. And right. I think they're trying to slant the field. They didn't get the bill, the hush your mouth bill, through. But here's another way to do it.
This is the next best thing.
Yeah. You go out with a public relations coup and try and push down people who disagree with you.
So, talking about illegal voters and fraudulent voters, let's get into a few specifics here. Were you aware that you can register to vote in Washington State with a utility bill?
I am not aware of that. I'm aware that you can register, you can change your vote. over the internet with just a license.
I got that next.
With just a driver's license. And there's no secondary check. There's no, they send a code to your cell phone.
Yeah.
The simple things that you would do accessing any social media account, we don't do in Washington.
Yeah.
And that needs to happen.
So I took some time one day to play an RCW map, right? Connecting this a lot to see how these things work. So this is what I found out how registering to vote works in Washington State, and I want to see a reaction when I tell you this because it's pretty unbelievable. So when you want to register to vote, you get your voter's registration form, right? Mm-hmm. There's 2 forms of ID that you need on there to be able to get your voter's registration: either your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of a social security number. Now, why it's only the last 4 digits is beyond me. And in Washington State, in order to get a driver's license, you're probably aware of this, you don't actually have to have any identification as long as the person working at the DOL feels that you've provided enough identification. It's in the law that he can give you the license. So there's that. Now, if, let's say, I'm not allowed to vote, I'm not a citizen, I fill that out anyway, I mess up the driver's license number, and I mess up the Social Security, the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. That registration is not rejected. I am now provisionally registered to vote, and I get a piece of mail back that says, hey, your information didn't match. Please send us your driver's license or your Social Security number or one of these alternative forms of ID, of which utility bill and bank statement are acceptable forms of identification. So, how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't feel great about it.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm running for Secretary of State, so that we can tweak those things that are wrong. The example that I gave earlier of driver's license, you can go, so I buy a drink before I came here and somebody asked to see my ID, snapped a quick picture of it. They can change my ballot's address to their house very, very easily.
Yes.
And there's no check on that. The only time I would know is at the next election when I didn't get a ballot. And, people don't pay attention to things like that. It's
even worse. And I went over this with Bill, was it with Bill Brock? Yeah, we looked at the voter portal, right? So with the voter portal, if I want to change your vote, I'm that bartender who gets your ID, the password is your birthday. So you log on there, Keith Wagoner, birthday, I'm in. With that driver's license, you can start clicking around and immediately change the vote. Now, what also gets me, and I haven't tried this out because this only works during an active election once your ballot's been mailed out. Once the ballot's been mailed out, you can go into that voter portal and say, I didn't get my ballot. And you can print one, which nullifies the ballot that actually got sent in the mail. So if I did that, you actually get your ballot. You fill it out and send it in. You think you voted. I actually canceled it, printed one out, and voted for you. And then when you go to look, you go, oh, yeah, I voted in that election because it doesn't tell you who you voted for in the portal. So, I mean, to the people who are saying that we have the most secure election system, now, I don't know who won in the last election. I'm not going to say it was stolen or not. But to the people who say we have the most secure election system, I mean, just the description of that is mind-boggling, don't you think?
I do.
Yeah.
I do think that, but as I said, with people on the far end of both of those arguments, you still have to treat it with respect,
right,
and understand, or try and understand their argument and try and show them with data and logic where their arguments are flawed without picking a fight, because that just doesn't work. Well, we've seen how it's working in society right now. People don't want to listen to each other anymore, and they're blocking people off, and they're not having good conversations like we're having right now because, oh, you said it wasn't fair. I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Right. Or you said it was fair, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Either way, pick your option. So we need to get better at listening, and you made some really great examples of where we can fine-tune the system. The system is not perfect, and anybody who says it is not the right person to have running the show.
Right.
Because we should be, in every area of our lives, in business and our personal lives, we should always be trying to improve, and we should understand that there are vulnerabilities. Heck, we update our computers once or twice a week for a new security patch. Do you think that our system of voting is invulnerable to such things? Of course it's not. So that's what I want to do. I want to provide a common sense, level hand I'm not agenda-driven. I'm not there so that Republicans do better in elections or Democrats. That's not the case. I want voters to do better in elections. And that means whatever the true vote is, that's what's registered and that's who wins.
So it's a slight conundrum. So in the example that I gave, particularly with being able to register with the utility bill, that's a legislative problem, right? That's something that you would actually be able to fix better as state senator and not as Secretary of State, because with the Secretary of State, you're like, well, that's the law, and I have to do what the legislature tells me to do because that's what it says to do in the Constitution, right? So if we make the assumption that there's some bad laws, and I think I just gave two really good examples, and you as a Secretary of State, it's your job to follow the law, how do you visualize yourself? I know I might be putting you on the spot and you don't have a direct answer for it, but how do you visualize yourself saying, okay, I have this bad law, but I want to make it right, and I can't, my hands are tied behind my back. How do you see yourself approaching something like that?
It's not a hard question. It's really a good question. It's kind of the key question, right? So because I come from the legislature, I understand that the legislature makes the laws by which the Secretary of State has to live and implement. In large measure. Now, there is some latitude for rulemaking in the office, but in general, what you say is correct. And we have to have a change in the legislature before we have a substantial change in the way the system works. Now, I have a reputation for working really well in a bipartisan manner in Olympia. In the last session, I will say as a Republican senator, you don't get too many bills as a rule. I had the second most of any Republican senator passed in the last session. That's because I can work with people. And it's going to require that kind of temperament to get anything done. I'm also the only candidate who's actually sponsored voting legislation. 2 years ago, I worked on, right after the 2020 elections, I went to the Secretary of State's office, then Secretary Wyman, and I said, hey, people are angry. What are some real things we can do to make it better? And I worked in that office to come up with a set of common sense changes to the system that would make it better. For example, one of the elements of it was, you talked about Department of Licensing. Well, people are accidentally getting signed up when they're not allowed to vote.
Yeah,
we're baiting people into breaking the law by our bad policies, and green card holders end up with ballots, and they're scared, like, oh my gosh,
I don't want to risk my green card. Yeah,
right. How did this happen? One of the elements of the bill would have required the Department of Licensing to have a signature pad, just like you use in the grocery store, where people had to affirm that they were a legitimate voter, a citizen, and a resident of Washington State, and sign it. I mean, instead of you get a wad of paper pushed at you and maybe the default...
Sign all these things, yeah.
The default says, yeah, I want to be signed up to vote. I think it's very important that we carve that out and laser focus on it. And what's it going to take? Another 30 seconds in the license line? Now, that bill, of course, I got a hearing. I got a hearing right after Governor Inslee's Hush Your Mouth bill got a hearing. So I was a little overshadowed. The press was there to see the governor talk about his First Amendment violation bill. But I got to talk about my bill, the Washington State Voter Confidence Act. And I would encourage people to read it because it's real legislation. It's not revolutionary, it's evolutionary legislation that would start to take back some control over who's getting registered and how we run elections. Also built into that was in some future election, we would do a signature comparison using our experts at the Washington State Patrol, so we could do 1,000 to 500 votes in every county, pull them out randomly, check the signatures. Why do that? Data. Do we have a 5% problem, a 0.5% problem, a 15% problem? We have no idea, and that's the problem. We're all shooting from no information. We feel it's this way or we feel it's that way, and the state can't even tell us what percents are questionable.
Right. Let's talk about signatures for a second, because this is a personal concern that came up to me recently. So we have this mail-in voting, which I want to talk about in a second, but the way it's checked is by looking at your signature. Now, for example, my wife, for my last birthday, was it my birthday? I think it was my birthday, got me some fountain pens. I've never written with fountain pens before, and I've had to change the way that I'm writing because I'm now writing with these fountain pens, and I said, you know what, I should work on seeing if I can make a better signature because now I have a better pen. My signature is now different from the way that I sign things when I registered the vote. Is that going to screw everything up because I decided to change my signature? So how do you feel about just looking at signatures to decide whether or not someone, that was the right person who filed the ballot?
Yeah, well, I know that sometimes that works because I have two signatures. I have my fast, crummy signature, and I have my careful signature.
Right.
And one time I voted with the crummy signature, and they called me, and I had to go down.
So someone called you.
Someone called me. I had to go down. But see, the problem is it depends on the county auditor and the people working in the county. And I believe they're dedicated professionals that work in these counties. They do the best they can. Not every county is resourced the same. Mm-hmm. Not every county has the same tools and funding. Not every county even uses the same machines to tabulate our votes. So we have a mismatch and a different level of, I won't call it competency, but a different level of resources that we give to each county or that each county has on its own. And I think the state needs to do a better job to fund them so that they can do a better job at the local level, because that's where this really happens. And the idea that the Secretary of State somehow counts the votes or something, that's not true. Mm-hmm. You go and you look at the systems in place and the processes in place, but at the end of the day, the Secretary of State is certifying something that they pretty much have to put their faith in. And I do want to talk a little bit about faith, because I'm pretty confident in the system that it's...
In Washington State, you're pretty confident?
I'm confident enough that I continue to vote. Now, that's a heavy qualification. Mm-hmm. If I thought the whole thing was not accurate and that my vote didn't matter, I'd quit voting. And people are. And that's one of the biggest problems I see with the lack of confidence in the system is self-suppression of voters. The left likes to talk about suppression based on race or socioeconomic or whatever. Of course, that is not right either. But I think a more insidious and deeper problem is self-suppressing because you don't have confidence. So there's a lot of faith when I or anybody marks on that ballot and you drop it in the box, you imagine that it goes to the right place, gets counted for the right person, and gets forwarded on to the state on election night and is properly done. But do we really know? And that's the problem. And where I think there was not enough good work to reach out to voters after the last election when things got kind of wild and there were so many questions, you were either, no, there's no problem at all, we have a perfect system, and that was kind of the end of it. And I don't think that's where we should have ended it. And if I'm elected, that's not where it's going to end. I'm going to keep going. I'm not a deep conspiracy theorist. I don't think that probably the Chinese beamed in secret codes or whatever. I mean, but you don't know what you don't know. I like to think you need someone there with an open mind who's willing to look at all those possibilities and not just shut people up and then fix, first of all, the low-hanging fruit and then do a deeper dive.
Let's talk about conspiracies. I've heard that the voting machine equipment is actually built in China a lot of the time. Now, that is a fact that could probably be easily confirmed or denied. But with, obviously, the Communist Chinese Party being in charge of absolutely everything in the country, because that's the whole point of communism, I don't think it's a far-flung idea that a country that's autocratic, building the voting machines for a country that's supposed to be democratic, or Republican in nature with democratic elements, might be incentivized to say, well, let's put some back doors in here so we might be able to fiddle with it, right? Now, whether or not that's happening specifically in Washington State would require an investigation. Are you telling me that you would be open at least to the idea and looking into it to confirm or deny it?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
I would 100% be open to any of those ideas that would potentially make our system safer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to have that, iron door of, nope, that's just crazy. I don't want to be that person because I don't think that respects the voters and the people who are concerned with it. Now, it may turn out that they're right.
Mm-hmm. And if they're right, get it out of there, right?
Yeah, and then we have to make some changes. Now, my instinct is that the computers are likely built in some foreign country.
Uh-huh.
They probably have components from all over the place, and whether there's a secret backdoor built in or not, well, I wouldn't think so. But again, you don't know what you don't know, and thinking that you know and having hard opinions about things that you don't know is a path to bad performance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to be on the path to bad performance for Washington State.
Let's talk about chain of custody.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard this argument, and I agree with this argument. And we're going to mix chain of custody with voting machines, regardless of whether they're built in China or Venezuela or wherever the heck they're from, right? If you stick something into a computer, I got this stack of ballots, I'm going to stick it into the computer to count. By definition, you've lost chain of custody because you can't see what's going on in that computer. Do you believe that's a far-fetched statement or no?
Well, I think there's two ways to check it. So the ballots come out the other side, they don't disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a way to check whether or not there has been corruption in the computer if you audit the paper copies. So absent an audit, I would agree that you don't know necessarily what happened inside that machine. I will say this, and this is my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, I believe, is not so much with the counting of the ballots, because I've been in the county when we've done recounts, and they're always maybe one ballot off at most. That's not where the error is getting introduced, not in the counting. The error is getting introduced in who's sending the ballots in. Are they legitimate voters? And we talked about that
rolls
at the beginning
Yep.
of the interview is, if they're fraudulent votes, we need a better way to find out. And we need, again, as I said with signature comparison that I want to do for data,
Mm-hmm.
we need to know how many. Is it, and when I made testimony on my Washington Voter Confidence Act, the left questioned me, and I gave the example, King County. So the King County voter administrator, she typed a letter up, sent it off to the King County prosecutor, and said, these 25 votes we know or believe to be fraudulent. And they were in categories, voted twice, person was dead, that person was dead, we caught it before it got counted, person was dead, we didn't catch it before it got counted. So this is not like made up crazy stuff. This is coming from official channels. And I said there was 20 plus in King County. And their answer was, well, that's just like getting struck by lightning. Well,
you don't know that. Yeah.
First of all, maybe that's the tip of the iceberg. Second of all, it's so important if that had been a police shooting of somebody and somebody responded in a callous manner like that, oh, well, that's as likely as getting hit by lightning, you'd be...
you still need to prosecute the lightning situation.
Right, you'd be shouted down. So, and because voting is the bedrock of our representative government system, we have to do everything, even if it is 20. We have to do everything to find out why and to prevent that from happening again.
And then there's also, I would say, value in, let's say there's one. You find one guy. Not 20, it's just one. You prosecute that one guy, throw him in jail or whatever the heck the fine is, to make sure that everybody else sees that that's a bad idea.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up the prosecution. So we had our staff run the numbers that we could find across the state. There were about 175 similar referrals by different county auditors to county prosecutors, about 175 people. 10 got some level of action, we don't know what. That is a terrible,
and action doesn't mean prosecution.
Record.
Action might just mean we kind of looked into it a little bit.
That is a terrible way to handle a very important crime. And even if it is one, the city of Cedar Woolley that I was mayor of once, 2 mayors before me, was decided by the flip of a coin.
Because it was a tie?
Because it was a tie. And if there's one fraudulent ballot in there, if there was, that somebody got robbed. I don't know who.
Yeah.
But, and maybe there wasn't. But you can understand maybe across King County, 20 doesn't matter. But in a local race, what if 5 of them were for the same city council position or school board position or something like that? We think of those as not being, quote, as important, but they are as important.
Yes.
In fact, local government, it probably has more impact on citizens than what we do in Olympia. So it's really important to find all of the bad votes and find out how they're getting there and send the signal that you talked about that it's not going to be tolerated. And right now we don't have that attitude in Washington State. The attitude instead is, if it's a problem at all, it's a small problem, and we're not going to do anything about it. I don't think that's a responsible way for the Secretary of State or the legislature or anybody to behave who has influence on our elections.
I like that answer. Thank you. I wanted to bring up, we were talking about voter rolls and looking into making sure if we've got suspected ballots, we need to look into them and determine if they're fraudulent or not, right? What about the topic of saying, okay, how do we address the voter roll sheet and make some effort to clean it up before those fraudulent votes have a chance to get out there? And what I mean by that is we spoke about Bill Brock, and I actually had Glenn Morgan on last week as well. And they're talking about the canvassing efforts that they're doing, which I understand is happening all across the country right now, which is to say, okay, we're going to compare the voter rolls to the USPS National Change of Address Registry or the Social Security death list or whatever, and see if they found someone who's registered and voted who, according to this list, is dead or according to this list is moved. Go to that house, knock on the door, and say, is there somebody here with this name living and voting? And they're finding it's like 40 to 50% of the names that they've generated from comparing these two lists are anomalies. Like, it's a lot. And they are having some success going to the local auditor and saying, okay, well, here's 900 names that we found. Can you get these off the rolls? And they're meeting various levels of, what's the word I want?
Cooperation?
Thank you. Various levels of cooperation depending on the auditor. But my understanding is that they've also sent them to the current Secretary of State, which is Steve Hobbs. And Steve Hobbs' response so far has been, ask your auditor. That's their job, not mine. So I wanted to ask you, if I got a list of 900 names from we went and knocked on these doors and they're not there and they voted, how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I'm very familiar with the work. And as you know, Bill Brook is the Skagit County Republican chair. So we're well acquainted. I'm well acquainted with all the hard work that our canvassers have done out there. And the correct word is anomaly. I mean, because right now, we don't know 100% for sure, but it seems suspicious, right?
Yep.
And I would say it actually is the area of the auditor to correct those things, but I also believe that the Secretary of State has great influence on what they can do from that office to encourage auditors to do the right thing. But the other piece is, and I think auditors want to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that. So I know I'm going to sound like a broken record. I'm going to go back to that bill that I sponsored in the last 2 sessions, the Washington Voter Confidence Act. Built into that was a requirement for the state to provide the death records to every auditor free of charge, so that they could use that tool. They don't have the tools to do that job properly.
I missed that. So are you saying that the auditors have to pay to get these records?
They run their own offices, and if they don't have the subscription to that service,
they don't get it.
They don't get it. So I think that ought to be funded by the state, that we need to endow our auditors with the best tools we can so they can do the best job. I don't think the auditors are a bunch of bad guys. I think they're folks who are trying their best with the limited tools, and that there's great variation in the tools and resources depending on where they happen to be in the state. Rich county, poor county, big cities, small cities and towns. And we ought to resource them equally so they can do an equally excellent job, not the best job that they can do with what they have.
Mm-hmm. I'm just still a little bit stunned that an auditor has to pay for that service and the state doesn't just provide it to them. So
that's why
thanks for introducing that bill.
That's why it was in my bill.
Yeah. Mail-in voting.
Yeah.
Just in general, how do you feel about mail-in voting?
So that's a double-edged sword, and I have heard other candidates and lots of people say we have to do away with mail-in voting, and I can tell you in the short term that's just not going to happen, because in general across the state, the one thing people love about our voting system is that it's convenient. And that level of convenience they're willing to risk, I believe, and they're willing to put the responsibility for security on people like me where it belongs to keep that accessibility. And I'll give you the example of my own parents. So my folks live way up on the hill off-grid, and they drive down to the mailbox once a day or into town once a week. Without mail-in voting, they're not going to vote. And I think mail-in voting needs to be fixed, but I don't want to throw it out.
Tell me what fixed looks like.
Fixed looks like cleaned up voter rolls. Fixed looks like making sure people are legitimate voters before they get registered to vote. Fixed looks like questioning ballots when they show up out of nowhere at the end of the election when one candidate or the other doesn't seem to have enough votes, and we just dump it all.
And we magically find the votes at 3 a.m.
Yeah,
after we stop counting.
And we don't question those. I mean, it's highly possible, or at least there is the possibility that they are legitimate, but people deserve to know how they got there. Those are all the fixes I would want to do. And I would also say that there's only 2 ways that we would ever get rid of mail-in voting. The legislature has to decide to do it.
Of course.
Not going to happen. I know there's going to be a lot of people out there who are like, oh, we don't like him. He said that's not going to happen. But that's what I truly believe. It's not going to happen. And an initiative to the people to get rid of mail-in balloting, and I don't think the votes are there for the reason I just explained. People like the convenience, and accessibility is important. So one thing that, even if you hate mail-in, lots of my friends and relatives do hate it, you can't say it's not accessible.
Well, so let me see if I can think of good examples of this. So at some level, accessibility is important. For example, if we had to vote on, if your vote doesn't count unless you can make it to the moon to vote, obviously that's ridiculous, right? Because we can't make it to the moon to vote, so nobody's going to vote. So at some level, there is some aspect of accessibility. However, if that accessibility leaves holes in the chain of custody, I have a feeling it's kind of like saying, well, my kids really want to eat sugar for dinner tonight. That's what they want, so I'm going to give them sugar. Do you feel that that's a bad analogy?
Well, it's not entirely bad, but
yeah.
Let's just say that, first of all, they're not kids, they're the voters. Second of all, there's no power to do it. There's not a way to do it.
Oh, I understand that. This goes back to the chain of custody thing, and you did answer it where you're saying, in some aspect, where you're saying we got to clean up these voter rolls, because my opinion, which is an opinion that could be corrected by different facts, is that in Washington State, I don't think the machine counting flipped anything, like you pointed out. I think the issue was we've got all these fraudulent voters on the rolls, all these ballots just fly in every direction, and however many ballots you can collect is how many times you could vote, right? And then, I mean, I'm not saying this has happened, but how hard would it be to get a database with a bunch of people's names and birth dates on it and then just go have 10 people sit in a room and one at a time on election night just go through and cancel ballots of people that you suspect are this party or that party. And even if you don't print them and send it a new ballot, you could at least cancel people, and they would never even know. Like, I guess you do have to actually vote for them, because then they would look at it and say, oh, that my vote was never counted. But theoretically, somebody could do that, right? So the game of cheating, if cheating is actually happening, is how can I acquire all these ballots that are flying around? And from what I'm hearing from you is to say, first of all, it requires legislation or an initiative to actually change that. It's totally something, like we said at the beginning, as the Secretary of State, your hands are tied from, you can't change that as a Secretary of State. But the question is, and the reason I ask it is, as a Secretary of State, like you said, that's an influential position where you can lean on things, and you do have certain tools available to you. So another example from me, I was going through the RCWs or the WAC. I can't remember which one it is. It's probably an RCW. The Secretary of State has the ability. They don't have the obligation, but they have the ability to compare the voter rolls to other government databases, USPS records and Social Security, blah, 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 whatever, and clean up the voter rolls. They may, not shall. Is that something that you may do?
It'd be something I'd be very interested in. And I think you've kind of laid out the reality of the problem versus the philosophy of the problem, where a lot of people say, well, why don't we just go back to the good old days and show up at our polling places in person and show our ID and go through? I just don't think that is reality as much as any more than I'd like to go back to 1979 when I was a high school senior and have the world that way. It was a better world, and I long for it, but I don't think we're going back. So what we have to do is go forward, and we have to fix what we have until such time that the people or the legislature decides that that's not the way we're doing it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that coming anytime soon. And it's a little frustrating for me when I see other candidates for this office promising that.
Because your hands are tied. You can't do it.
Because it's totally impossible. So either they don't understand the job, or they're willing to just make claims that they're
bluffing because the people don't know the inner workings of the machine.
But to your point, the problem is, are there ballots out there flying around for people to take advantage of? Are there? We know that has happened. I talked to you about evidence that was provided by the King County election supervisor. And that was just one county whose letter I happened to get from a staff member. Mm-hmm. Presumably all 39 counties have some problem of that type. We need to pare down the lists, make sure that they're legitimate. We need to quit registering people who probably don't even want to be accidentally registered through the motor voter registration, where people are kind of like hurried on through and, oh, too bad if you got a ballot by accident. You're actually criminalizing someone without their knowledge by having a bad process. And if we can pare all of those problems down, then I think we take away a pretty clean system. And then you reevaluate.
Cleaner, at least.
Yeah, and
I don't know if I would say it's pretty clean, but it's cleaner, yes.
And it's a process of constant improvement. So if you get it down to whatever, I'll make up a number. Let's say we're 5% wrong right now, whether that's intentional or accidental or whatever. Let's just say it's 5% off. Well, when we get it down to 3%, we don't stop there. We keep looking at the problem, and you keep looking, because just like computer software, there's always a bad guy out there who's willing to try and exploit the system. Mm-hmm. Some people just do it for sport, I think. It's evil, but there's people out there who do it. We need to be on guard for that continuously in our election system, because, let's face it, government screws things up all the time. I'm thinking right now of the unemployment insurance payouts that were fraudulently went out, almost $1 billion. We got to tune up those systems. We also got to tune up our election system consistently and continually.
Well, I thought having $1 billion go out fraudulently is a good thing, and you got promoted for it.
Seems to be the case. If you're following, I wouldn't call it quite a current event, but recent past events, that seems to be what happens. Yeah.
I had to throw that one in there. Okay, here's another example. I want to just put the situation, and we'll presume it's true just for the sake of having a discussion, and I want to see if something like that is true, your Secretary of State and someone brings it to you, how you would go about dealing with it. So Glenn Morgan of WeTheGoverned.com made a video a couple months ago of a homeless woman who...
I watched it.
Okay, you know what I'm talking. I'll repeat it here just in case someone hasn't watched it.
And I love Glenn, by the way.
Yeah. So this homeless woman who's apparently recently unhomeless, grew up homeless, and was working to get homeless people who had grown up homeless ballots for the first time. And so she went around registering people to vote, and I guess she registered several hundred people to vote. And when voting time came around, they all went, not all of them, some of them got their ballots, but the most of them went, where are our ballots? Where do they go? And of course, they're homeless, so where you got to register them for the mail to show up somewhere. And she had been saying, okay, well, they're all going to end up at this place. And she was working with some governmental agency, I can't remember which one. And when she tried to bring this to the attention of the person at the governmental agency, that person literally turned around and ran away. So the suspicion, there's no proof, and this is the problem, half the time you can't prove anything, is somebody collected those ballots. It could have been hundreds. And there may be a homeless industrial ballot harvesting scheme going on, and which is a quagmire. It's a total quagmire. So if I have this quagmire and I slide it over to your desk as the Secretary of State, how would you begin dissecting that quagmire?
Yeah, well, first of all, I did watch that segment.
Yeah.
I watched it several times, and several friends sent it to me. And do I believe the woman is telling the truth? I absolutely believe she was telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was sincere, honest testimony, and that's a problem. So the Secretary of State's office does have some investigative capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it from some past employees, that branch has been pared down under the current Secretary of State.
That's you mean the branch that supposedly this woman ran away or whatever? Yeah.
No, people who are in charge of investigating in the Secretary of State's office.
I understand. Got it.
So I would like to see that built back up. And if it is a decision that the Secretary of State gets to make on where to put resources, and I think it would be because that's an executive branch, I would build up the investigative branch because investigating anomalies or wrongdoing is important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how important that has been to past secretaries of state. It seems the current Secretary of State has at least minimized that if he's downsizing in that area, as was reported to me. But I would want to build up that element within the Secretary of State's office so we can do investigations, especially something like this that seems to have like a compelling story with compelling evidence and actual people you could go talk to.
And it could be one zoom-in spot of it happening all over the place. Yeah.
And we don't know.
We have no idea.
And I'm not going to suppose that it happened in 100 places or 10, but we know that it happened in one place.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I like the point that the fact that you pointed out. There's multiple aspects and branches of government here that all have certain amounts of authority over this problem, right? And the Secretary of State, in a lot of cases, doesn't have any authority. Like, for example, back to at the beginning, you can register to vote with the utility bill. As a Secretary of State, you can't stop that. That's in the law. That's the legislature who has to fix that. However, you go back to, okay, what influence does the Secretary of State have? So I think what I'm getting from you, and you can tell me if this is incorrect, is where you don't have power to fix things, which is a lot of places that you wouldn't have any power as a Secretary of State, you would work to use your influence.
Right, you have the power of advocacy.
Yeah,
I'll give you an example that is from the Senate, but it translates. So, several senators and I and our staff put together a paper last session that's called 5 Years of Failure at the Department of Corrections. And we published it, and we did a press release, and we made it available to the legislature, and it laid out all the problems that we saw and where we thought there were decent fixes that could be made.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same type of approach that will be valuable in the Secretary of State. First of all, you have to be willing to advocate. That I think is one of my strong points, because I want to get to the bottom of it. And second, you have to have the tools to do it, and that's something that you can make in the Secretary of State with staff. And you have to have those connections to the legislature, which I do have.
I think that's a big one, is coming from the Senate, and if we're to take your word for it, I mean, we should be able to look at your voting history and figure this out, but if you are good at handling things in a bipartisan fashion, if you take that experience to the Secretary of State, I guess if you have to walk into the legislature to ask for something, you're right at home. Right?
Absolutely. And, the Secretary of State does ask for sponsored legislation. It'll say so right at the top. By request of the Secretary of State, this legislation. We've seen that from the current Secretary of State and past Secretaries of State, and you will see it from future Secretaries of State.
And to put that in easier words, you're saying that as a Secretary of State, you could draft up legislation. You just got to find a senator
to sponsor it,
or a representative to sponsor it. Yeah,
right. And maybe I'm over optimistic, but I'm feeling like 2022 is a very good year to bring balance back to the legislature that would help get some improvements at the Secretary of State's level in terms of how we run our elections.
Mm-hmm. I'm out of questions for you. Is there anything that you feel that I didn't ask that's really important that you wanted to address?
Well, I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning where we talked about the duties of the Secretary of State aren't all about elections. I know that's the most important thing and what I'll be talking about the most on the campaign trail, but I want people to understand that I'm qualified across the board in terms of what the Secretary of State is required to do, and that's to provide strong leadership. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I think I am highly qualified to represent the state in these international missions with commerce and cultural exchange, particularly in Washington, where exports and imports are so important. And I have deep knowledge and training in working with our Asian partners to build trust, to build those cultural ties, to get our agricultural exports out. You know, you wouldn't think of the Secretary of State's office as being involved in commerce and getting our apples sold, say, to Taiwan or Japan or South Korea.
But you are.
But that's actually something that the Secretary of State deals with. And I spent time at the United States Embassy in Tokyo in a capacity there as a military officer where we did these types of exchange. In my case, it was training and equipment for the military, but I interacted a lot with the Department of Commerce. I worked under Ambassador Baker back in the Bush administration. So I have a depth of knowledge and experience that translates well to this office, and I just want folks to focus on the whole person and the whole job and not one tiny little element that happens to be super important right now. I understand, but
or at least is on everybody's mind right now.
Certainly. Yeah. Elections are on everybody's mind, voting's on everybody's mind, and it probably ought to be, but don't forget the Secretary of State's office is a much bigger picture. 300 employees, the state archives, the state library.
Well, let me follow up with a question about that. Do you see any issues if we take the election conversation off the table? What about the state library and the foreign diplomacy in quotes and the corporations division and all that sort of stuff? Are there any glaring issues that you see in any of these departments that you'd like to address?
Well, I wouldn't call them glaring issues, but it's like maintaining our roads. Mm-hmm. We have to keep involved in all of those aspects. So you can't focus all your resources in one area and then ignore other duties in that office. And, it's kind of interesting when people say, well, you should be an auditor. if you're going to be the Secretary of State. And I have always pushed back on that. Well, why shouldn't I be a librarian then? Why shouldn't I be an archivist then? Why shouldn't I be a career diplomat then if you're going to parse out the pieces of the Secretary of State's responsibility that you think are important? And the point is that you don't need to be any of those things. You need to be a good leader. So I told you I was a Navy pilot. I didn't know how to engineer or put together a helicopter or work on it, but I ran the people who did, and I flew the machine. So that's where I think there's sort of this false narrative that being an auditor is some sort of magic key to running the Secretary of State's office efficiently. It's just not.
I see. Well, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, just thank you for having me here.
How do we find you? How do people support you? Where do we go?
Right. So the campaign is on its way. I was under the legislative freeze. I don't know if many people know this, but we cannot fundraise 30 days prior and then until the end of legislative session, which got out almost a month ago now.
And that's a law to make sure you're doing your job and not out campaigning, right?
That's right.
Yep.
But I would say the governor's appointee started out with a surplus fund account of about $300,000 from several failed state races that he's run. So he's been able to poke away an awful lot of money, and I need to do some catching up. So if people could go to WagonerForSecState.com.
Let's pull it right up.
Oh, great. Thank you. WagonerForSecState.com and join the team and send us a few bucks so we can fight back and get Washington on a straight and true course.
Awesome. Well, Senator Wagoner, thanks for being in here. It was a great interview, and when you're on the campaign trail, I'd like to have you back on to see see how things are going and see what sort of response you're getting.
Great, yeah, I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. All right, well, this has been Dylan Moore with IRETA TV, and you can find us at ireta.tv, and if you go there, at the top of the screen, you'll see a video menu and a social media menu where you can look and find all of our social media and all the places we host videos, which is no longer YouTube because we've been banned, but I guess that's just a Medal of Honor in this current weird censorship phase of the world. So, again, this has been Dylan Moore, IRETA TV. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.